Good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. It is just after 10:30 in the morning, and we have with us the state treasurer as we go through our trying to understand what might be happening at the federal level in all kinds of areas. And so, Treasurer Pichek, we're delighted to have you here to talk about federal funding, tariffs, cash flow, whatever, you're thinking about this a lot, I know, as our treasurer. So we appreciate getting the benefit of your wisdom here. So take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And yeah, thanks to the committee for having me. That's exactly right. I was planning to talk a little bit about the federal funding. It impacts our office directly very little, but there are certainly conversations to be had around revenue that our office generates to the general fund that potentially could be impacted by a changing economy, the cash flow situation with the state of Vermont, and then happy to talk about tariffs as well. So just to jump into it, on the federal funds, we did receive the committee's memo, and we have almost basically no federal funding that impacts our office's operations. We receive a small amount of money every year from the forest services from the federal government that is eligible for emergency responders, basically in Bennington County, that respond to emergencies on federally owned land, forest land. And that is a pass-through through our office, so it doesn't impact us directly. We did have application from the town of Winhall this past year. That's maybe the first application we've ever received under that program. So it doesn't have a significant impact either directly to our office or even to some ways indirectly into the towns in Bennington. We're glad to see the application come in, but that's the first one, like I said, that we've had probably in 5 years, maybe in terms of the entire time we've been running that program. But the other place where there could be more of an impact is thinking through one of the revenue sources that our office generates, which is interest income. So we have, created about $90 million of interest income over the last fiscal year. That's sort of roughly the estimate. Some of that is for special funds, but a significant portion goes directly into the general fund. And we've talked about this in the past, but the reason that number is so high, let's say like 5 or 6 fiscal years ago, that number 90 million might have been 700,000, like a pretty small number. And the reason it's gone up so much is because our cash position has gone up quite a bit, and then interest rates have gone up quite a bit. So both of those things are high, our cash and interest rates. Now, what we were sort of expecting to happen slowly over time was that the cash position would come down a bit. There's about $400 million in federal ARPA spending that will come off of that number over the next 18 months, 2 years, I think 2026. There's some federal FEMA reimbursement money that we're waiting to receive that's close to that number as well, $400 million when we talked about it last. So those things will sort of potentially even themselves out over the next couple of years in terms of outflows and inflows. But we did expect generally it to come down a bit as federal spending is out the door. And then we also expected interest rates to come down a bit over this year and next year. And there was an interest rate cut in the not too distant past. And both of those assumptions sort of have to be reevaluated. The amount of cash we'll have and then what the interest rates will be. In terms of what the interest rates will be, we are now in an uncertain environment. It's possible that interest rates will stay where they are right now for longer than expected. So we may very well earn more money on this cash than we anticipated earning. Interest rates may even go up because the Federal Reserve has sort of given some indication of that. Some folks that watch that space closely are now suggesting that's a possibility. So if interest rates go up, that may mean more money's earned on the cash that we hold. But it also means a couple of other things that may impact the amount of cash that we have to invest in the short term. One is that, it's possible that we're going to be in an environment where we are seeing interest rates go up, we are seeing inflation go up, but at the same time, the economy is not going strongly either. It's actually in a recessionary state. And when you have those things happening at the same time, unemployment going up, GDP going down, interest rates going up, inflation going up, sort of this period of stagflation that can be quite detrimental to the economy. But if it does mean a recession, we'll want to be watching state revenues closely, because in all likelihood, we would have less state revenues coming in, less cash to be investing. I would imagine that we would see, to date, we should know, and I know you had the Secretary of the Agency of Administration, and, we have not seen our revenue numbers miss the mark through February. So we want to pay close attention to those. I think we probably want to pay close attention specifically to rooms and meals and to sales tax, to some degree corporate tax, and then personal income tax. But I think in that order, they'll sort of demonstrate any impact in that order. I think there'll be a lag in the corporate tax. There'll be a lag in personal income in terms of maybe seeing it missing the mark. But sales tax and rooms and meals tax, would be more sensitive to both recessionary pressures and potentially price increases as well, which I'll get to on the tariff question that you asked. So to summarize that, we may have less money in our bank account to earn this interest income on because we have less state revenues coming in to invest. The flip side of that is the federal revenues. So as this committee knows, about 1/3 of the state's budget is federal funding. If that federal funding does get cut, we would have less cash again to invest in the short term to earn these rates that we've been earning over the last few years. So on the one hand, interest rates may be higher than we anticipated in terms of being stable. Interest rates may actually go up. That's uncertain. That could benefit us from an interest revenue standpoint, but cash flows could be down in terms of state revenues coming in and federal funds coming in, which would impact that 90 million or so in revenue that we've been earning in interest income in the last few fiscal years. I would say with all of that, it's really too early and too uncertain to know in any of those categories what exactly is going to happen with interest rates, with the state revenues, with the federal funding. But it's something that we're paying, close attention to. And like I said, we'll be like everybody else in state government, watching closely the revenue reports and particularly interested in sales tax and rooms and meals tax. I'll mention the cash flow issue and then I'll come back to the tariff, which.
Hang on one second.
Oh, yeah.
I'm wondering, the rooms and meals, I'm also concerned about, and to some extent, the sales tax, with the fact that our friends to the north in Canada are canceling things and not buying. We know Vermont companies who aren't able to sell in Canada right now. That may affect corporate income tax, but it also affects sales and revenues and rooms and meals pretty clearly. And it is somebody somewhere, I don't know, maybe it's the Agency of Commerce, but we're going to be tracking those kinds of tourism things in some way. And obviously that affects property taxes too.
Yeah, for sure. So, the tariff discussion kind of gets roped into the Canadian tourism question in a way because of, the sort of affront that Canadians feel for the tariffs being imposed. But it's beyond that, to your point. It's the rhetoric around being the 51st state and their premier being called their prime minister being called the governor and such. So, whether you have friends that have visited Montreal or Quebec City or Vancouver or wherever, you hear the sentiment on the ground from people. You hear stories about grocery stores segmenting U.S. made products. You hear people say, I'm not visiting Vermont or the United States over the next 4 years. We've been up to the Kingdom Trails, and they described people calling and canceling. Same with Jay Peak. So how do we monitor this? One thing in our office, we've been keeping an eye on is just the number of border crossings that occur from passenger vehicles at our border crossings. Now, there could be people coming in from Canada through other ways. They come in through New York, they fly into Vermont. But I think the border crossings in Vermont are just a good indicator of, is traffic down for passenger vehicles versus previous years. And what the border crossing data shows is that February, which is the month that we have the most recent data for, is the low point. It was the low point last year, the year before. Pre-pandemic, it was the low point for border crossings. But then they start to pick up quite rapidly in April and May and June and July, even August and September, and they start to come down again. So border crossings year over year for February in Vermont were down about 8.5%. They were down nationally more like 17.5%. We'll want to look at that closely for March and April to see how that materializes. In terms of flights into the United States, you hear reports where those are down from Canada much more considerably, like 50, 60, 70% in terms of bookings. So something else we'll want to watch, but I think for Vermont, it's probably that border traffic that is how people usually get to Vermont for tourism. And then the only other point to mention, Chair, is I grew up in Brattleboro, and we would not see too many Quebec license plates, right? But Northern Vermont, Burlington, much more frequent to see Quebec license plates. So the impact from a lack of Canadian tourism will impact certain parts of the state more heavily than other parts of the state.
Right. And we've got two more questions, comments. Rep. Harrison, and then I'm sure has a serious comment, and then Rep. Kosenska.
Mr. Treasurer, thank you for joining us. I have admitted to the committee members here on several occasions that sometimes I can be a Debbie Downer. And I get the sense of what I'm hearing is you're joining me in that distinction today with the possible outcomes that we're looking at. So thank you for sharing my misery sometimes.
Okay, John.
Misery loves company.
Yeah, something like that.
Mike, I'll try not to be a Debbie Downer this morning here, but where I live here, and we do have entities like Keenan Trails here, where 30% of our visitorship comes from Canada, and a lot of it primarily from neighboring Quebec here, but from really all parts of Canada and other people from other countries as well. We're seeing coming up
right
here, and obviously folks who live here in the U.S. Regionally here. So as we're looking towards monitoring I shouldn't say whether it's in addition to border crossings here, regionally here, what the impacts are looking like here as best we can know regionally here. So Northeast Kingdom, if we have a fewer percentage of Canadian visitors coming down, that trickles right into all the restaurants and stores and people staying overnight and other spending as well here. Because as much as we have that 30% coming to Kingdom Trails, we're seeing a lot more families coming. I'm intimately involved with that particular entity here, and it may not be all family members are biking here. Other family members are doing other kinds of things here as well. So we have to kind of take a look at the impact here across all, recreational opportunity sectors here the best we can. And it's too early to tell right now. We have some anecdotal information, some direct information of people calling and saying, we love coming to Northern Vermont here, we love going to Burlington, other places here as well, but we're going to take a break this year because. So, the more updated tracking we can get, we're not going to get weekly information here, but as close together as we possibly can, because the season opens here in about 3 weeks.
Yeah, exactly right. So we'll, I think the March data will come out at the end of April. It's sort of the border data seems to be lagging by 3 or 4 weeks. So we'll do our best to update that and get it to the committee to the degree that you're all interested in it. So we'll try to find some other ways to get more updated data as well, and do our best on that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just throw one more thing to you here. You can think about this, but what information would you need from us people that live in that region, perhaps through our chamber here.
Right, that's a good point.
As well. So we should maybe just have an offline conversation about that.
Yeah, that would be great because, you know, the Lake Champlain Chamber put out a survey to its members recently about, do you think your business will be impacted by tariffs? But a similar survey about how is your business being impacted by Canadian tourism being down, potentially being down, would be, I think, useful for everybody.
Jeff Dickinson, who's also online, Mike has a question. Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, thank you. In terms of cash flow, you have created a bunch of different options of how to use that cash flow money in the past couple of years. As this cash flow starts to diminish, and it seems like it might diminish sooner rather than later, that has an impact on those programs. And I'd like you to ask you about that. But the other thing I also want to ask about, and this maybe when you get into tariffs, but we have a problem with our pensions. And this stock market is not helping us at all. So what are your thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, so I mean, on the cash flow, you know, generally, you know, our numbers are much higher now than they were pre-pandemic. We have this morning about $1.9 billion in our cash fund. Pre-pandemic, it would be $200 or $300 million in our cash fund. And everything else that we had pre-pandemic is sort of scaled up to that. So our monthly cash outlays, what we're paying, are higher than they were during the pandemic. The program for housing is higher than it was during the pandemic, but we've taken a conservative approach. You know, we're able to go to 10% of cash, but we really are 5% or so of cash. So we've taken a conservative approach, even though there's a lot of capacity there, knowing that things can change, and we expected from the federal side cash flows to go down. So there is a lot of liquidity, even though in those scenarios where federal funds may be cut and revenues may go down, you know, more likely than not, corresponding spending would also go down. So it may mean we have less cash, but it shouldn't mean we have less liquidity to pay our bills and make sure things are being paid on time. So it's obviously something we want to monitor very closely, but we're feeling good about the liquidity piece. We obviously, if we had a period of time where there were federal funds that were cut or state revenues that were lower than anticipated, and we were maintaining spending at the level that was higher for a long period of time, that could impact us in the same way it would, you know, at any time pre-COVID or post-COVID. But we have quite a bit of flexibility and liquidity in our system at the moment, which is good. So we're coming into this in a good spot. Also, our cash is generally the highest in July and then gets sort of to a low point in December. So that's something we'll want to keep an eye on. We'll have really good liquidity throughout the year, I think, but we'll have particularly good liquidity through the summer and into the early fall. And then we'll want to watch closely what is happening to revenues and federal funding during that period. In terms of the pensions, you know, they're also well positioned at this time. You know, the stock market has gone down, but our revenues from the state, from those investments, we are cash flow positive in the pension system and in the OPEB system. So we're not in a position where we have to liquidate the investment holdings to pay for benefits or pay for pension payments. That would have been the case 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago. And it would have been a double whammy that not only were we not earning money long-term on the investments that we had to liquidate to pay out, pensioners, but we'd have to liquidate the investments at a loss as well. So because we're cash flow positive, we, you know, who knows what's going to happen to the markets, but we can sort of get through this period, hopefully relatively unscathed. And as you know, we have a smoothing mechanism for our investment returns. So any one particular year, whether it's a really good year or a really bad year, gets smoothed in over 5 years to sort of lessen the impact of any, market volatility that may occur in a particular year. So we had a year, I think it was 2022, that was a down year that should be cycling off our 5-year smoothing the next couple of years. If we end up having a down year this year, that will come on to that schedule. But that will certainly protect against some of the volatility.
Okay, one last thing. I think I read somewhere that the administration in Washington is trying to claw back some ARPA money that we have not spent yet. And I can't remember if it's in the Department of Health or Public Health. This is money that we counted on having, and it's under contract, and it's for grants, and we have to December of 26. Is that something that affects your office, or is that something that will just go through the agency or the department?
Yeah, I mean, we expect that money. We were talking about how we expect potentially the revenue from interest income to go down, partly because that money will be spent down over the next 2 years. So we sort of are anticipating that it will be spent down. So whether it's spent or whether it's clawed back, the analysis is kind of the same for what's the revenue impact in terms of interest that we earn going into the general fund. But I think it potentially could impact both us, since we're holding the funds, and the agency itself if there was a legal or other kind of conflict in terms of is there authority to claw the money back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, continue, Mike. Thanks.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think we covered the cash flow piece.
Yeah, I think so.
I just want to look at my notes.
Okay.
So I think the last question you asked was about tariffs, broadly. And I said I wanted to get back to the sales tax and rooms and meals tax piece, because I think that's another place where you potentially will see sensitivity to tariffs as they, well, I guess I'll back up. The tariffs that have been already imposed, which include quite a number of them, if you think back, there are particular tariffs on China prior to this reciprocal tariff announcement, Canada and Mexico, automobiles, steel and aluminum, tariffs against countries that buy oil from Venezuela. I think I have them all, but I'm probably missing a couple. And then there were the reciprocal tariffs that were announced last week. So when you think about the impact of all of those tariffs, if they stay in place, because that's a big question, sort of uncertain what the federal policy objective is it a negotiation tactic where these tariffs will come down, or are they up for the rest of this administration, regardless of what kind of bilateral trade agreement foreign country may want to achieve? So I think that's uncertain. But if they stay up, the impact estimated by, there's a number of different estimates out there. The Yale Budget Lab, which we've been tracking since the tariff trade war has started, I think is a good, reliable source, nonpartisan. And they expect a $3,800 per household impact in terms of cost increases. So everything from groceries to cup of coffee, clothing, buying a new car, buying a used car, just price increase on an annual basis of $3,800. Now, it's not that it would go up every year, $3,800, but it would go up $3,800, and that's sort of that elevated level that the price increase would be. So if you think about how many households there are in Vermont and equate that out, it's over $1 billion, just over $1 billion of additional cost. Now, consumers are paying the higher prices. The companies that are buying the foreign materials are the ones paying the tariff, and they're passing that down by way of higher prices. So just to, this committee knows these numbers, but just to give you a sense of, that $1 billion number, our sales tax revenue is in the ballpark of $700 million. So our sales tax, all the sales tax we collect, is less than what this potential tariff impact could be. Property taxes went up last year significantly, and the total additional revenue collected was I think it was just over $200 million in that ballpark. So again, a sense of those increases to Vermonters and the impact it had, $1 billion of increased cost and spending obviously would be very significant. So I think if you're seeing that materialize, if the tariffs stay in place and you're seeing these costs being borne by consumers, you're potentially seeing less, just less ability to spend and purchase things, and less ability to go out and have dinner or travel, both for Vermonters and potentially for people in New England. So that's where, again, paying close attention to the sales tax numbers and the rooms and meals tax numbers, I think, will be important. And then, of course, the corporate revenue numbers as well will be important for that reason. Another point, we've been hearing from businesses, of course, through our office, through the federal task force that we've set up to sort of hear feedback. And, what we're hearing sort of unfortunately is sort of academically what you would have expected prior to the tariff announcement, which is that Vermont may be more susceptible to, our Vermont businesses rather, this is not just the consumer piece, but now into the business piece, that Vermont businesses may be more susceptible to the impacts because we are smaller businesses generally across the board. So you're hearing smaller businesses say our competitors are buying aluminum or steel or lumber or whatever the material is at great quantities right now to stockpile their inventory to avoid the impact of tariffs. And as a small business, I don't have the capital to be able to do that. Nor, the other thing we hear is, nor just even buying my normal materials that I need are now in short supply because other bigger companies are buying them to stockpile them prior to the tariffs. So a small business is not in a position to be necessarily strategic and make those kind of purchases to at least avoid some impact from the tariff. That means their prices will be higher than their larger competitors, and their larger competitors already probably have a price advantage built into the market. So it's just compounding that price advantage. The other thing a larger business may be able to do is to absorb some of those costs of tariffs so they don't pass it along dollar for dollar to their consumer. Again, a smaller business, all things being equal, will be less well positioned to be able to absorb those higher costs of buying materials, and they will have to pass it down to their consumers. So again, you're in a situation where in a competitive price difference, a larger competitor is going to be better positioned than a smaller business in terms of being able to offer their product to the purchasing public. And then the last thing is a larger business, not just strategically potentially pre-purchasing inventory and other materials, but they may be able to, they may have multiple supply chains. They may have the ability to pivot to different supply chains that are less expensive or costly. And a smaller business will not have the diversity of supply chain and will have a harder time pivoting to other potential suppliers as well. So I think both from a consumer standpoint, which is a more generalized impact, that impact is something that will be felt broadly by Americans, regardless of where they live. That is something that will impact the whole economy. Thinking about the Vermont specific impact, the fact we have smaller businesses competing in a global environment, even our large businesses are small businesses relative to the global economy. They're going to be in a tighter spot, but our really small businesses in Vermont, which we have many of, will be in a potentially tighter spot than other economies, other state economies across the country.
All right. More to ponder on the tariff side, huh?
Yeah. And I think, just from a global standpoint, again, I guess I'll just to indulge Representative Harrison's Debbie Downer side.
Go for it. We might as well just get it all over with this morning.
I appreciate the help here. Thank you.
The thing I worry about the most is a scenario where you have reductions in federal spending, and you heard from the Medicaid director. I mean, that's something that is on the radar of Congress, and that would come in the next budget, I guess, in September, October, whenever they're able to pass the next budget. But in an environment where you have reduced federal spending and you're thinking about, as a committee, as a legislature, how do you potentially fill some of these gaps, or do you fill some of these gaps, or is it even possible? You may be having that conversation when state revenues are not expanding in the way that they have in the last number of fiscal years, but are actually contracting because of a slowdown in the economy. So it may be a question not just of how do you fill these new gaps that are created, but how do you even maintain what we have in terms of state support for various initiatives. So that's something we're keeping a close eye on, how that develops, both in terms of the strength of the economy and what federal policy decisions are made.
You're singing my tune. Thank you.
So it's amazing to me that pre-COVID, we were getting $750,000 interest. And I know we also had less money in the coffers, so that contributed to it. We saw that graph you gave us before.
Yeah, less money and almost nothing in terms of interest income, in terms of the interest rate.
Right.
And it wasn't, now we get a really good rate from short-term treasuries. We get a really good rate from different funds that we can invest in the short term. We get a really good rate from our deposit institutions. Our banks at one point were, I think it was as high as 5.25% on interest rate. So our team has done a really good job maximizing all of that. We have a good contract in place with our deposit banks. They look competitively for other short-term investments. So they've done a great job, but we benefited from higher cash and generally more options to make money in the short term.
Right. Which certainly helps us when we're budgeting. So that's, it's gonna be hard if and when that goes. Jim.
Yeah, Mike, I do appreciate how you've laid all this out and a lot of things that sometimes we can't control, but we have to be aware of. But I find it interesting, whatever it was, 5 years ago when the pandemic hit, we're in some cases looking at the same thing. The stock market was crashing, businesses were closing down, everything, it was like we were definitely headed for a recession. But what saved it was the massive influx of federal money to restart the economy and get it going. And I can't help but wonder whether or not the federal government, because we've gotten used to the higher amounts, has the wherewithal to be able to do that, even if they wanted to do it, because, we've continued since then to just dramatically increase the federal deficit. And it is a concern. I don't have the answer to it, but it is a concern that we've been spending on the credit card, and which was rightfully done, I think, in 2020 and 2021, but we haven't gotten back to reality. So we're starting at a point, I think, that makes it very, very difficult to apply that same medicine to the situation today if it does decrease much further.
Yeah, for sure. It's been maybe about 6 weeks since I sort of did my own analysis. So I'm just going to have to try to remember. But, there's sort of 2 points that you're making. One is like a fiscal point and one's a political point. And like putting the politics aside at the federal level, on the fiscal point, we probably could continue on the way we are in terms of the federal deficit and the national debt, maybe for another decade or two before fiscally we are in a position where interest rates would go up because the United States is looked at more risky. There's a risk that we wouldn't be able to pay our debt. That has a dragging effect on the economy, that you all of a sudden are in a position where even if you wanted to bail out an economy because of an economic issue or pandemic, you fiscally would just be constrained to be able to do it. So that is a possible scenario. I think it's a little bit further out than right now, but right now there's a political reality of, I guess, 2 things. One, there doesn't seem to be the interest in terms of like, how do you tackle that problem that may be developing on the horizon from a fiscal standpoint. But I think the political moment is that there may actually not be a desire to provide the same kind of relief if we are seeing that. And it almost seems to be the opposite desire, that the cuts in federal spending are intended. So I worry about that. You're right that the monies after the pandemic or during the pandemic, not only did they help get the economy going, but they were a life preserver for so many businesses and organizations that let them exist through this period of uncertainty. They were able to pay their bills, able to pay their employees, able to actually be in operation once the economy got going. And if we don't have that kind of if we have a downturn in some of these worst case scenarios, then you worry about how those small businesses and organizations will be able to get through that period of time without fiscal help from the federal government.
Hey.
Thanks, Mike. Anything else from the committee? Mike, you have anything else you want to talk to us about at this point?
No, although we were having an internal discussion, and I do think the moments, almost 5 years ago exactly, not just the pandemic, but the market volatility in February of 2020 and March of 2020 was more significant, both in terms of the anxiety in the marketplace and individual investors than right now. Also, I guess if you're going to look at that same analysis, the border crossings for 18, 19, 20 months during that pandemic period were basically zero from Canada to the United States. So we're down 8.5%. It might be even greater in the coming months, but it won't be as bad as that moment. So, there's some hope there that it won't be as bad as this 5 years ago. But to the Representative Harrison's point, there was federal policy that helped us get through that. So we're just going to have to be patient and calm and thoughtful and proactive where we can be to make sure we're staying on top of these emerging trends and how best to respond. So look forward to be helpful to the committee any way that we can.
Thank you. And we don't know how long this is going to last. I mean, that's the other part. We can look back now on COVID and what happened. And originally we thought we'd all be out of the legislature for 2 weeks, then we'd be back, and that didn't exactly happen. So when you're in the middle of things, right, we don't really know where the end is because you're in the middle. So anyway, we really appreciate your time and your thinking, and look forward to continuing to work with you on all of these things as they emerge.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having us in, and thank you for the work you're doing to sort of surface all these issues throughout state government.
Great. Okay. Take care. We'll see you soon, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee. Let me find our agenda. We're going to be on break in a minute. We're on break until after the floor, and immediately after the floor come back, and we have James Duffy talking about IT funding. So it's not about the ADS billing thing. He came in and did that, but he has an IT funding kind of conversation that we'll get to have and talk about. And then after that, the state's attorneys and sheriffs are going to come in. They have put their spreadsheet together. I'm going to talk with Aaron about how we're going to have all that. But some of the non-direct agencies under the Secretary of Administration are starting to bring in some things. I think judiciary, we're going to have tomorrow morning come in. So we're starting on our path that way. We did get a third and final letter out to everybody yesterday. Aaron, is that on our website now?
Yes.
Okay, so the one that was sent out yesterday afternoon under my signature from our committee to state agencies is now on the website of what we're looking for. It's changed a little bit from the very first one, but it's still the same kind of idea. So that's it until right after the floor. Oh, on the floor, I'm going to be asking to commit budget adjustment number 2 back to our committee. So you'll hear me standing up to do that. We have a little museum going on over here. So we're adding that in a special TIF category. And so we have all kinds of things, big board. So that's where we are. So we'll see you back here right after.